but at a certain point, someone gets so much responsibility because they have a broadcasting to so many people that they, like they weren't going for having such a broad following, but they do. And with that comes responsibility. Like a lot of critiques of Joe Rogan is that he lets on a lot of people who should not have
his platform.
Yeah, his platform.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's interesting too. So that's another conflicting of principles.
But who's to say that he shouldn't do that? It's his platform. He's created this instrument by which he wants to have a conversation with somebody. Why are you the judge of who he should or should not have on his program?
Because a lot of people are very convincing and they use tricky talking tactics to convince someone who's not equipped to dismantle their arguments.
Yeah.
So like someone could go on there and convince Joe of things that really are bad, but he just can't see through in the moment because he's not an expert. And so by convincing him, they also convince a lot of his following who is, just takes what they hear for granted.
Yeah. And I love Joe Rogan for his side of his contribution to wanting to learn every side of things. Like, I think that's that's kind of an idea right there, is like his principle is he wants to give everyone a voice, hear everyone's side. But where that collapses is when you're letting Alex Jones on the podcast and, I can't remember. There's this like psychologist guy who's just the worst that goes on there once in a while.
I think I know who you're talking about. Sam or something.
I don't know.
Yeah.
He's just like, he's all about this weird, like biological psychology side of things. It's super like sexist. And I don't know. He's a bullshit guy, but,
there's another point I was going to make, which is, his attitude, I think, is very good. Like, a lot of people should learn from him that, hey, judge everything for yourself, be open to other people, listen to other people, and evaluate things for yourself. Like he emphasizes thinking for yourself, critical thinking skills, which I think is great. But
he's a brilliant conversationalist too. Like, he's
all right,
really
but
good at conversation.
at the same time, you're contradicting yourself. You're saying you love his idea and you love his principles, but not everybody should be allowed to go and put out their views and their ideas and their principles. It's completely hypocritical.
I'm just saying that for his following, he does not have a strong enough knowledge to engage in conversation with other people and call out the negative things that some people say.
I mean, maybe from your perspective, he doesn't, but like, that's just because maybe you disagree with somebody's other, moral principles and views on life. Like what we've talked about before is your truth is your own, right? You understand and perceive the world in the way in which you want to, your own moral truth. You having the viewpoint that you think it's okay and you love the idea of everybody being able to judge something for themselves, and hearing that some conversations shouldn't be allowed to be had or heard by some people, or views given by some people, is just, those two things don't work together. They conflict.
Yeah. I mean, that's a good point. I think that's kind of like the crossroads of what we're talking about right here, is that
I agree with free speech. It's like which is why it comes down to people need to be able to educate themselves and form their own opinions through actual facts.
Do you think
I don't think that means that we should censor people. I think that means we should give more access to proper education so that people can properly decide for themselves what is real and what is not real, what is right and what is wrong. But I think that moving in the direction of censoring is how you get to, this is going to be a big stretch, but like, the idea of, the book Fahrenheit 451 is the Ray Bradbury tale of dystopian state where books aren't meant to be read anymore by people, and that the only information that you get is fed through a singular media source. It just takes a bunch of those steps. Maybe it takes a couple hundred years, but that's how you get there.
Right.
by
starting
to
censor.
The slippery
when
slope
do you stop
thinking.
censoring?
Yeah.
So that you can't do it. You can't censor.
Well, no, you can. It's just it's a key of moderation. It's not going too far in one way, which is say anything you want. All free speech is great, versus too far in the other way of completely stomping out something. There's a an in between of this is wrong for X, Y, and Z. This will lead to this. We don't want this. So calling this out, we're describing why we're doing this, and we're putting a kibosh on it, versus the other side, which is, oh, this is just bad. We're not going to tell you why. We're getting rid of it.
Well, Cheek, think about how at the beginning, like you said, there are some 100% truths outside of math and science, like the fact that that is a pen, or the fact that that there weren't rigged elections, yet Joe Rogan was able to have people on that were proponents of the fact that there were forged ballot boxes and people in vans bringing in false ballots. And Joe Rogan was sitting there. It's not like Joe Rogan sits there and is like, no, that's not logical. That didn't happen. Because there is a fundamental truth that that stuff wasn't happening. There's evidence that it hasn't. But if you don't listen to the evidence, then it sounds convincing. And Joe Rogan sometimes takes his stuff in stride as a conversation and listens to it. And I'd say one of his biggest flaws is he's too trusting without second guessing it. So in a world where there are fundamental truths in a conversation like that, is it right or not to let that information go out unfettered to a listener base who trusts him undoubtedly when it's when we know it's not a truth?
Well, outside of Joe Rogan too, this happens on Facebook. Like people will have advertisements. I know that in some other countries there are political advertisements where they are like jammed down people's throats because they were giving, our whole country uses Facebook. It's how it, like, again, like Mark Zuckerberg was not prepared for all this power and doesn't really know how to control it. And so we're in this weird realm of not knowing what to do.
Yeah.
I think that in the case of products like Facebook, Twitter, Joe Rogan Experience, those are products that that those people have created, that they're in charge of. They are allowed to do with whatever they want. If they want to censor, great. If they want to not censor, fine. But I think where I'm especially passionate about this is the government can't be telling you to censor it or not censor it. Because that's the step where you take where freedom of speech is being threatened.
Yeah. And you're putting your faith in the side of humanity, which I would probably tend to do too. Because
if things are right or are not right, it's up to us as a society. Like, this is an extreme example. Say you're in a group of people and people of all colors, and one of a white person says the N-word. Everybody is going to turn and look at him and say, that is wrong. You would hope, at least, right? In a perfect society. That's what we as a society need to do with all the other disinformation that's going around as well. To decide that things are wrong and not leave it up to the government to tell us what is right and wrong.
Yeah.
Because when you start giving the government that control, the government will abuse that power like they have in the past.
I think that paranoia in the government comes a lot from, like you was saying earlier, that's a logical fallacy of saying that you take this step, then all of a sudden we're going to be 15 stories up after starting at the base floor. Like, we're still in a voter-based society. There's nothing there. I'm not agreeing necessarily with the censorship of people like Joe Rogan. I'm just saying that, like, to think of little steps like this as what they could become is such a drastic way to think of things, and it's not the right way to think of things, in my opinion, because that's not what's happening. No one's saying, all right, we're going to be for Fahrenheit 451 tomorrow. Tomorrow, if that's what we're going with, tomorrow Joe Rogan can't give audience to people who are lying, or delusional without at least a disclaimer. And that's kind of like the same logic that supports people who want anti-gun laws or who don't want anti-gun laws, because they're saying, oh, we need our guns because if the government takes away our guns, that's just the first step for the government stepping on our throats and killing us.
So I think I understand what you're saying, and I totally agree. I think that with certain topics that needs to be examined, and certain topics, left a little bit more up to society.
Yeah. It's case by case. It's not black and white.
Yeah.
It's a gray area. And that's the issue. And right now, like, I don't like to leave things up to capitalism necessarily. And the system that we have now is left up to capitalism. It's working in some regards, like with the whole Twitter thing. Like, most of Twitter's people were saying we need to shut this guy up. If most people were saying we love Trump, Twitter wouldn't have silenced Trump, But because there was an overwhelming sentiment that people wanted to put disclaimers on Trump's tweets and things like that and eventually ban him, Twitter says okay. But they don't ultimately care about the moral high ground. They care about what keeps their business running. They've got thousands
ain't that true?
Yeah. But that being said, let me just make sure I covered enough. I think it would be, we might have left our listeners with enough things that that they could maybe, if you are listening, comment, let us know what you think, how we could expand this conversation. I think a challenge for everyone listening is you have to get comfortable with ambiguities. Just being absolute about things, just saying this will lead to that. Absolutely. We're going to saying that gun control is going to lead to takeover by the government, I think is not necessarily a rational way of thinking about that, and thinking about, in your day-to-day lives and conversation, not being black and white isn't the most pertinent thing. But in the way you perceive your world, maybe it's fair to put context into your everyday decision-making and interactions with people. Cheek, were you going to say something?
Yeah, I think that I took a little bit of a hard stance there. I want to run it back a little bit. I just think that free speech is something that is very dangerous to toy with.
Mm-hmm. I think you're right.
Because once you give someone the power to change the lens in which other people can understand or not understand other people, that's very dangerous. I understand it's very dangerous to let people spew whatever as well. And I think you're right. It needs to be a case by case basis. And me saying, free speech, take away that, and you got Fahrenheit 451. I get that was a little alarmist thing to do there, but.
Well, Cheek, I would hope our listeners understand that we need to have someone like you take an opposing view to challenge ours at the same time. So sometimes you do just jump to the other side just for the sake of conversation, and it works well for the show. So I would hope